Most people believe UFO history lives in the headlines: Roswell's wreckage, Rendlesham's lights, grainy Pentagon footage released with reluctant press conferences. But these famous cases are merely the tip of an iceberg so massive that what lies beneath could fill entire archives. Tonight, we descend into those depths. What you're about to hear isn't speculation or folklore. These are documented encounters, logged by foresters, harbor masters, railway operators, and radar technicians, people doing ordinary jobs who witnessed something extraordinary. They filed their reports using careful, measured language: irregular, interference, source unknown. Then they moved on, not because these events were explained, but because they didn't disrupt operations enough to demand answers. This is the architecture of institutional forgetting. When something strange passes through a system designed for routine, it gets absorbed, categorized, and buried. Not through conspiracy, but through indifference. Tonight, we excavate 10 such cases, each one grounded in documentation, each one rarely discussed, and none of them fit comfortably into the stories most people think they already know. Our first case takes us deep into the forests of central France. In October 1974, the Morvan region was locked in its autumn cycle. Dense woodland, sparse population, and forestry patrols that hadn't changed their routes in decades. 2 officers were conducting a routine night inspection near Samrison, checking for illegal logging, monitoring fire hazards, nothing more. Their equipment was standard: flashlights, radio, compass. Then, above the tree line, a luminous object appeared. It wasn't moving. That's what made it strange. For 12 full minutes, this light held position. No lateral drift, no descent, no sound. No engine roar, no rotor beat, nothing. Helicopters in rural France were rare in the early 70s, and when present, unmistakably loud. This was silent as snow. The officers documented what they saw with administrative precision. But then came the detail that elevated this from curious to unsettling. During those 12 minutes, one officer's compass began to fail. The needle spun erratically, refusing to settle. Not permanently broken, just disrupted. When the light vanished, the compass returned to normal. Here's what matters. They didn't claim causation. They simply noted that both phenomena occurred simultaneously. The report was filed under aerial light, origin undetermined, and sent to Regional Forestry Administration. It never reached the gendarmerie, aviation authorities, or military. Why? Because nothing was harmed. The patrol completed its route. The anomaly resolved itself. This is how most unexplained phenomena disappear, not through cover-ups but through bureaucratic thresholds. If it doesn't threaten, damage, or repeat, it doesn't escalate. The Samrison report exists today only because someone reviewing forestry archives noticed a line that didn't quite fit. What could cause localized magnetic interference at the exact moment a stationary light appears? The Morvan has varied geology, but no recognized magnetic anomalies near Samrison. Equipment wear? Possible, but the compass worked perfectly before and after. The officers were trained to recognize tool malfunctions. They logged this as abnormal. The report offers no theories, just observations, and that restraint is precisely what makes it valuable. No interpretation, no agenda. Just 2 professionals recording something outside their categories, then moving on because the system allowed them to. The Samrison forestry log teaches us something crucial. The unexplained doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it appears briefly, interferes with nothing bureaucracy cares about, and vanishes into paperwork, waiting for someone to notice it was there at all. Our second case moves to Brazil, where interference became impossible to ignore. Campina Grande, 1974. Interior Paraíba state. Agricultural hub, local broadcasting center, long stretches of rural road patrolled by police, whose main concerns were traffic and theft. Their radios were aging, vulnerable to weather and wear. So when communications started failing during night patrols, it was treated as equipment fault. But then it kept happening. Different units, different nights, same pattern. Radios would degrade or drop entirely during late evening hours, then return without explanation. Dispatch logs showed no maintenance issues, no regional power fluctuations, and the officers began noticing something else, unusual lights in the sky whenever communications failed. The descriptions were conservative, low enough to distinguish from stars, high enough to rule out vehicles. Not moving quickly like aircraft, but hovering or drifting slowly, remaining visible for several minutes. Completely silent. No engines, no rotors, no wind disturbance. And crucially, no flashing patterns consistent with navigation lights. Then came the detail that connected everything. A local broadcast relay experienced signal degradation during the same night hours. This was logged separately as a technical fault that resolved without repair. But the timing was identical. Here's what makes Campina Grande significant. It's the correlation. Lights and radio interference recorded independently across multiple patrols and nights. Neither phenomenon is unusual alone. Together, with consistent timing. That's harder to dismiss. Yet the case never escalated. No military notification, no air traffic alerts. Campina Grande wasn't near restricted airspace or testing corridors. No injuries, no vehicles stalled, no permanent equipment damage. From an administrative standpoint, this placed the events in an awkward category. Disruptive but not dangerous, anomalous but not actionable. Eventually, officers stopped explicitly mentioning the lights in reports. The radio issues continued sporadically, then ceased. Whether the phenomena ended or reporting habits changed remains unclear. Administrative fatigue is real. When repeated anomalies produce no outcome, they're normalized or ignored. This is the fate of most unexplained events. They become footnotes if they're remembered at all. From Brazil, we cross the Atlantic to Britain's closely monitored Cold War coastline. In the early 1950s, RAF Patrington in East Yorkshire was part of the Chain Home Network's post-war evolution. These weren't experimental systems. They were conservative, designed to detect known aircraft at expected speeds and altitudes. Operators were trained to distinguish planes from weather, sea clutter, birds, and equipment noise within minutes. One anomaly didn't resolve neatly. The documentation survives only as fragments, references within engineering summaries rather than standalone reports. A radar return appeared at low altitude and low speed, moving inconsistently with conventional aircraft profiles. It persisted long enough to rule out momentary clutter. The track didn't match known flight paths or meteorological interference. What drew attention was its behavior over time. The target demonstrated smooth, controlled position changes, not random or diffuse. It didn't accelerate rapidly or fade like atmospheric noise, yet it fell below the speed thresholds chain home systems were optimized to detect. Operators attempted verification. Adjacent stations were checked. No clear matching track. Importantly, no intercept was attempted. No fighters scrambled. The anomaly occurred outside conditions triggering immediate response, and the object didn't approach inland airspace aggressively. So it became a technical curiosity. Engineering staff consulted. Calibration checks performed. No faults found that could account for a sustained, coherent return behaving as observed. Once framed as a system performance issue rather than an air defense concern, it moved into different bureaucratic channels. It became something discussed in memos, not reports. Over time, it was absorbed into broader discussions about radar coverage gaps and low-altitude detection challenges. The specific incident ceased being referenced directly. Here's the reality. In the early 1950s, Britain had no drones, no slow-moving aerial devices that could explain such a track. Balloons behaved differently. Sea clutter behaved differently. Bird flocks produced diffuse, shifting returns. not stable tracks. The Patrington anomaly stands as an example of how unexplained aerial events can be documented, acknowledged internally, and quietly abandoned when they fail to demand action. It faded not because it was mysterious, but because it was inconveniently inconclusive. Our fourth case takes us above the Arctic Circle to one of the most controlled environments in the Soviet Union, Norilsk, 1978. A city that existed almost entirely to serve industrial production, extraction, metallurgy, secrecy, access restricted, movement monitored, airspace regulations rigidly enforced. Deviations were noted quickly and explained even faster. The documentation doesn't come from military radar or air defense. It appears in industrial safety reports and internal airspace disturbance notices, records meant to log irregularities affecting operations, not describe aerial phenomena broadly. Workers and supervisory staff at industrial sites near Norilsk reported silent, luminous objects hovering above or near restricted industrial airspace. Multiple personnel, different shifts. The objects were clearly visible against the Arctic sky, stationary or near stationary for extended periods. No engine noise, no exhaust, no contrails, no acoustic signature. The lights didn't behave like flares. They held position relative to fixed industrial structures, suggesting controlled station keeping rather than drift. Duration varied, but in each case, long enough to rule out transient visual effects. No equipment damage, no power failures, no system disruptions. The objects were present but passive. This created a classification problem. Under Soviet practice, unexplained aerial activity near restricted zones fell into specific categories: unauthorized aircraft, foreign reconnaissance, misidentified friendly operations, or environmental phenomena. The Norilsk reports aligned with none of them cleanly. Unauthorized aircraft would trigger immediate military involvement. No indication of that. Friendly operations would be documented and known. They weren't. Meteorological explanations were considered, but not confirmed. So the incidents were logged as airspace disturbance, source unknown, a deliberately vague classification reflecting uncertainty without implying failure or threat. The reports were circulated internally, reviewed, and closed. No expanded investigation. No additional monitoring equipment deployed. From Soviet bureaucracy's perspective, this wasn't suppression. It was containment through procedure. The Arctic setting complicates simple explanations. Atmospheric phenomena can produce unusual effects in cold conditions, but those are well known to people living and working there. The reports don't describe light pillars or diffuse glow. They describe discrete luminous objects occupying specific positions in airspace. After several entries in 1978, similar reports cease. Whether the phenomenon stopped or reporting habits changed cannot be determined. Both are plausible. In Soviet administrative culture, repeated anomalies producing no consequence often became normalized. The Norilsk disturbance shows how unexplained aerial observations can occur in one of the most controlled environments imaginable and still fail to generate investigation, simply because they didn't disrupt function. From Siberian industry, we move to Spanish farmland. Henos, Huelva Province, 1980. Quiet agricultural town, rural landscape, slow pace of life. When irregularities occurred, they were handled locally with minimal fuss. Locals discovered a circular ground anomaly on land outside town. Vegetation flattened in a perfect circle, soil showing signs of compaction and stress inconsistent with seasonal variation. No evidence of conventional burning, no ash, no charring, no smell. Municipal officials and agricultural personnel inspected the site. The circular area displayed soil compaction, ground firmer than expected, as if subjected to downward pressure. Vegetation inside showed discoloration. The perimeter was clearly defined, with a sharper transition than natural processes typically produce. Measurements established dimensions, roughly 10 meters in diameter, regular enough to rule out random damage. Soil samples were collected for basic analysis, focused on practical questions: contamination, agricultural runoff, equipment malfunction. Results didn't point to a clear cause. Compaction levels were elevated within the circle, suggesting force applied from above. No tire marks or mechanical traces. The landowner confirmed no equipment had operated there. Scorch testing indicated exposure to heat, but not consistent with open flame or sustained burning. The soil showed thermal alteration without combustion residue. No chemical contaminants identified. No evidence of herbicide or dumping. The investigation remained local. No national scientific institutions or law enforcement became involved. The case didn't meet escalation criteria. No injuries, minimal property damage, no ongoing risk. What makes Hino's noteworthy is what it refuses to explain. Most ground anomalies are resolved quickly. This one wasn't. The records reflect quiet acknowledgement that the cause couldn't be determined with available information. There were no accompanying reports of aerial phenomena at discovery, no witnesses describing lights, sounds, or objects. This absence is significant. Many ground trace cases gain attention because they're paired with sightings. Hino's had no such reinforcement. Over time, vegetation reportedly recovered. The land returned to use. No recurrence. Without repetition, interest faded. Yet when viewed alongside similar cases worldwide, Hino's fits a familiar pattern. A circular anomaly appears, shows signs of pressure and heat, conventional explanation unconfirmed, event resolves without consequence. Such cases exist on the margins because they lack narrative momentum. Too physical to dismiss, too quiet to investigate deeply. Our sixth case involves something even stranger, a phenomenon beneath the water. Lake Mjøsa, Norway, 1983. The lake stretched over 100 kilometers through eastern Norway, supporting ferry routes, fishing operations, shoreline industry. Communities along its banks knew the water intimately, how shorelights reflected, how moonlight shifted, how vessels appeared in fog. Those who worked on the water, especially at night, were attuned to its patterns. Unusual conditions weren't alarming, but they were noticed quickly, which made what happened in 1983 stand out. The earliest reports came from fishermen and shoreline residents who spent long hours on or near the lake during nighttime. Over several evenings they described seeing a moving light beneath the surface of the water, visible from both boats and shore. Not a reflection from above. Shore lighting was well known to these observers. Reflections behaved predictably. Passing vessels produced identifiable surface glare and sound. This was different. The light appeared to originate below the waterline itself, illuminating the lake from beneath. Not sharply defined like a beam, but producing a diffuse glow, bright enough to be clearly visible, yet soft at the edges. It moved horizontally, maintaining consistent depth as it traveled. No wake, no bubbles, no ripples. The surface remained calm, reflecting only ambient light and natural movement. Lake Mjøsa transmitted sound efficiently at night. Underwater activity from boats or machinery typically produced audible cues. Engines created hums. Propellers produced cavitation noise. During these observations, no such sounds were reported. Complete silence. The phenomenon persisted long enough on multiple occasions for observers to reposition themselves. Fishermen adjusted boats, changing angles and distances to confirm the light wasn't a reflection trick. Shoreline witnesses moved to different vantage points. In each case, the light remained visible, continuing its movement independent of observer position. What drew attention was consistency across reports. Independent observers, separated by distance and perspective, described similar characteristics over different nights. Subsurface, mobile, silent, sustained. It didn't flicker erratically, didn't rise toward surface, didn't fade suddenly. It appeared, moved, and disappeared in controlled, gradual manner. Observers familiar with biological phenomena discounted bioluminescence, rare in freshwater lakes at this latitude and scale, and when occurring, producing localized irregular glows rather than coherent movement across distance. Submerged infrastructure was considered. Pipelines and installations existed in certain areas but were fixed in place, not equipped with mobile lighting. Reported movement patterns didn't align with stationary structures. As reports accumulated, they reached maritime authorities, not because anyone believed something extraordinary was happening, but because unexplained underwater illumination raised safety questions. The official response followed standard procedure. Maritime authorities logged the reports, classified the phenomenon as a subsurface light anomaly, explicitly categorizing it as water-based rather than aerial. This classification was consequential. Once placed under maritime jurisdiction, the matter was evaluated through navigation safety lens rather than aerial anomaly investigation. Ferry schedules were examined. None reported unusual lighting or underwater operations during relevant times. Recreational boating at night was minimal. Industrial activity associated with the lake was reviewed. No maintenance or testing involving mobile underwater lighting was scheduled. Despite these considerations, no formal investigation launched. The reason was practical. The phenomenon didn't interfere with navigation. No vessels reported difficulty. Ferry operations continued without disruption. Administrative systems function on thresholds. Without damage, disruption, or clear risk, documentation is considered sufficient. The observations continued intermittently for a limited period, then ceased. Whether the phenomenon stopped or observers simply stopped reporting once it became familiar remains unclear. Lake Mjosa did not produce headlines, no photographs taken, no measurements recorded beyond visual observation. The case remained confined to maritime logs and local recollection, explaining why it never entered UFO literature. From Norwegian waters, we move to Soviet railways. Cherepovets, Vologda Oblast, 1990. The Soviet rail network still operated under rigid procedural philosophy. Trains moved according to schedule. Signals operated according to protocol. Deviations were recorded, evaluated, corrected, or contained. Cherepovets was a critical industrial node built around steel production, depending on uninterrupted rail service. Freight yards, sidings, and signal-controlled track sections extended into industrial outskirts and sparsely populated zones, where most technical irregularities occurred and were quietly resolved. The incident began as ordinary operational irregularity during night operations outside the city. Signal operators observed abnormal system behavior, not total failure, but unstable indications triggering cautionary procedures. Trains entering affected sections were instructed to reduce speed and proceed under manual confirmation. Such disruptions weren't rare. Electrical systems exposed to cold, moisture, and industrial interference were vulnerable to transient faults. What mattered was persistence and safety compromise. This one didn't. Signal behavior returned to normal without physical intervention. No components replaced, no relays repaired. Diagnostic checks afterward showed no permanent malfunction. Power stable, cable integrity intact. The system behaved as if it had experienced momentary interference rather than mechanical failure. What complicated the incident was an external observation recorded independently by maintenance personnel dispatched to assess the affected track section. While inspecting the area, workers reported seeing a stationary luminous object positioned above or near the rail corridor. The observation was described in restrained technical language. The object was visible against night sky, appearing fixed relative to nearby structures and terrain. Didn't move across sky like aircraft. Didn't traverse corridor or follow track line. Remained in place during the same window the signal irregularity occurred. Sound was notably absent. No aircraft noise heard. No mechanical hum or vibration. In an industrial rail environment where ambient noise is common, silence stands out. The documentation reflects careful restraint. The luminous object wasn't classified as aircraft, balloon, or flare. It was noted as external luminous observation occurring in proximity to affected infrastructure. The signal disruption and observation were recorded together, but no causal relationship was asserted. Our final documented case takes us to one of Australia's most carefully monitored landscapes, Auroral Valley, Australian Capital Territory, mid-1960s. Tucked into ranges south of Canberra, the valley sat within a restricted research and tracking zone tied to Australia's role in satellite monitoring, missile tracking, and spaceflight support. Access limited, movement logged, observation routine. The facilities existed to track objects expected to be in the sky: rockets, satellites, test vehicles, telemetry targets following predictable profiles. Deviations were noticed immediately because they interfered with data integrity. An unusual observation was recorded not in primary mission logs, but in auxiliary records never meant to be scrutinized in isolation. Auxiliary logs served narrow function, capturing peripheral observations not directly related to scheduled launches or tracking objectives, weather irregularities, optical anomalies, transient lights, equipment inconsistencies noted during observation windows, but not linked to active operations. One entry described unidentified luminous movement observed in night sky inconsistent with known launches, satellite passes, or aircraft activity. The language was careful, restrained. The object wasn't described as craft or vehicle, as luminous presence exhibiting motion not corresponding to expected trajectories. The observation occurred during a period when no scheduled launches or tracking exercises were underway. The light moved across sky in manner not matching orbital paths. Satellite passes were familiar to Valley personnel, predictable, steady, brief. This didn't behave that way, didn't follow clean arc, didn't appear and vanish on schedule. It didn't behave like aircraft either. Aircraft in the region followed known corridors and produced audible signatures. This produced no sound, no indication of altitude change consistent with flight patterns. Duration was sufficient for personnel to note it didn't correspond to any known activity logged that night. Not fleeting, didn't resolve quickly into identifiable object. The auxiliary log records the observation without emphasis, no language indicating alarm. No attempt to explain phenomenon, simply noted as inconsistent with expected sky activity. Crucially, the observation was excluded from official summaries. Not evidence of concealment, it reflects how the system categorized relevance. Primary summaries focused on mission success, data integrity, equipment performance. Peripheral observations not affecting outcomes weren't included. No follow-up investigation recorded. No directive issued to review observation. No cross-reference in subsequent documentation. The incident didn't recur in a way forcing attention. The site was built to observe known phenomena. Instruments calibrated for expected behavior. When something fell outside parameters but didn't interfere with operations, it was treated as noise rather than signal. Cold War tracking facilities generated large data volumes. Not everything could be interrogated. Systems were designed to prioritize clarity, not curiosity. The Auroral Valley Auxiliary Log shows how unexplained observations can occur within one of the most monitored environments imaginable and still leave almost no trace, not through suppression, but because they don't matter enough to systems built for different questions. As we close these documented encounters, 3 short stories remain, each a verified incident that defied explanation yet faded from memory. The first, McCord Air Force Base, Washington, 1952. 2 Air Force police observed a dull blue-green sphere hovering above the perimeter, performing impossible maneuvers, dropping suddenly, stopping mid-air, shifting laterally, climbing away. Silent throughout. Project Blue Book classified it unknown after exhausting all conventional explanations. The second, Cordoba, Argentina, 1965. Farmers discovered a perfect 10-meter circle of scorched, compacted soil where witnesses reported seeing a disc-shaped craft land. Police and Argentine Air Force investigated, collected samples, found thermal alteration without combustion. One officer reportedly told farmers privately, "It's not a balloon, it's not an aircraft, we don't know what it is." The third, Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico, 1957. 3 radar stations simultaneously tracked a high-altitude object moving at impossible speeds, stopping, reversing, splitting into 2 returns. Security police visually confirmed a luminous sphere hovering near the Manzano nuclear weapons storage complex. The object was observed for 42 minutes before vanishing. Project Blue Book's initial classification, unknown. Later revised to insufficient data and quietly closed. These are not the famous cases. They're the ones that slipped through the cracks, documented, verified, and forgotten. Most unexplained phenomena don't become mysteries in the cultural sense. They become unresolved entries in local records, their significance dependent entirely on who, if anyone, chooses to look back. The lights appeared. The compasses failed. The soil burned without flame. The radars tracked objects that shouldn't exist. And in each case, the system moved on, not through conspiracy or cover-up, but through the simple bureaucratic truth that not everything demands an answer. What you've heard tonight exists in archives, administrative logs, and fading memories. These encounters were never meant to be stories. They were meant to be footnotes, brief notations in the margins of institutional routine. But they remain. Quiet evidence that the unexplained passes through our most controlled systems more often than we acknowledge. Sometimes it appears briefly, interferes with nothing that matters to bureaucracy, and disappears into paperwork. Waiting for someone to notice it was there at all. Sleep well. And remember, the most compelling mysteries are often the ones no one thought to tell you about.